Coca-Cola and Kraft Foods sever their ties with a little-known but powerful conservative national advocacy group. Who's behind the American Legislative Exchange Council, and what makes it so influential in U.S. politics? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. It's a low-profile organization with connections to high-profile corporations. Among its funders and board members, ExxonMobil, Walmart and Pfizer. The American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, describes itself as a non-partisan public-private partnership promoting limited government and individual liberty. Critics say it's a powerful, ultra-conservative group behind controversial state laws, including the Stand Your Ground law used by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer, to justify his shooting of an unarmed teen, Trayvon Martin. They also accused the organization of pursuing a coordinated effort across the U.S. to push for voter ID laws that civil rights groups say disenfranchise millions of minorities and low-income voters. This week, Coca-Cola and Kraft Foods severed their ties with ALEC after a boycott campaign by the civil rights group Color of Change. And anger over ALEC's influence on a range of legislation affecting the environment, education and labor rights has been a major issue among Occupy protesters across the country. But ALEC members say the group does nothing more than bring together members of the general public, the private sector and the federal government to develop policy. Here's how Arizona's ALEC chairwoman and Arizona State Representative Debbie Lesko described the group's activities in December.
They get together and so that we can share information and educate each other about major issues such as improving education, pension reform, and fiscal responsibility. It's a great organization. It's been around for years, and I find it to be very helpful and educational. It's just basically model legislation. Nothing is really drafted there. We don't draft any legislation. We discuss legislation that may have already been used in other states.
So what makes the American Legislative Exchange Council so powerful? To discuss this, we're joined by Lisa Graves, the Executive Director of the progressive non-profit investigative reporting group, the Center for Media and Democracy. From New York, we're joined by the civil rights group Color of Change Executive Director Rashad Robinson. And here in Washington by ALEC supporter Nicole, Neily, a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, a non-profit conservative organization. We should note that we did reach out to ALEC to come on with us, but we have not so far got a response. Rashad Robinson, the charge from supporters of ALEC is, what's all the fuss about? This is simply about stakeholders coming together to discuss policy. Surely this is a very healthy part of the democratic process.
Well, I heard the intro and the way that ALEC likes to describe themselves. They're a $7 million organization. No one thinks they're getting together for some sandwiches and tea to talk about legislation. They're drafting model legislation and they're pushing out around the country. But here is, I think, the big point that I think we want folks to understand about our campaign here, is that we've never asked ALEC to do anything. You know, we understand where ALEC stands on a whole host of issues, and they share a different vision for democracy than we do. They share a different vision for who should be able to vote in elections and who should be able to participate and the type of laws that keep us safe in our communities. Our questions are not to ALEC. Our questions are to the corporations who every day come to Black Americans and want us to buy their services or want us to use their products. Our question is to them, where do they stand? What are their values? And we're absolutely pursuing a free market campaign that really allows corporations to make a choice. Do they want to stand with an organization that promotes stand your ground, kill at will laws? Do they want to stand with an organization that promotes discriminatory voter ID laws and voter suppression laws? And if they want to stand with ALEC, then they have a choice. Thankfully, corporations like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Kraft have made the right decision. And for corporations that are unwilling to make that decision, we're going to do everything we can to make sure our members are able to make their voices heard to those corporations.
So Rashad there then, Nicole, is talking about the results of the deliberations in these ALEC meetings. But let's go back then a step to what some would say were the smoke-filled backrooms of corporations and legislators hatching legislation which is then repeated around the country and passed around the country. That does sound a bit fishy, doesn't it?
Well, I don't think so. I think there are a lot of groups in Washington and around the country that bring people together in forums like this to discuss laws that affect them, that bring together corporations, that bring together legislators, that bring together stakeholders and constituents. There's the National Conference of State Legislatures, that is another organization that...
But that's just legislators, though. That's not
corporations also participate. They sponsor side meetings there, and they're a much bigger organization. They actually have a $16.8 million budget. There's the Progressive States Network that also works with state legislators. So I don't think that this is an unusual format to bring people together, because I think it is well within individuals' and companies' rights to approach legislators who will be voting on issues that affect them. A lot of these corporations, as Coca-Cola has stated, come to these meetings because they're interested in tax issues, they're interested in labor issues. They haven't participated in the criminal justice policy issues. So I think companies can be involved in ALEC and certainly in NCSL and not even be privy to what's going on in other sections of the organization.
So, Lisa Gravesend, this is just an all part of democracy. And anyway, your own Supreme Court says corporations are people, or effectively people, so surely they have a right to participate in the democratic process anyway.
Well, quite frankly, the description of ALEC, I think, is not entirely accurate, because ALEC isn't like NCSL. It's not like Progressive State Network or other groups, in part because what ALEC does is it allows corporations, corporate lobbyists, and special interest groups, private think tanks to have an equal say behind closed doors in meetings with legislators. So there are legislators in this country who go to ALEC meetings at fancy resorts. They go behind closed doors with no press present, with no members of the general public present, and they actually give an equal vote to corporations, corporate lobbyists, to themselves.
Well, we probably have to explain that. We'll have to understand then the whole structure of ALEC. Well, let's just start at the beginning then. What are the origins of ALEC, and how do those three groups fit in then? The legislators, the representatives of corporations, and a board of scholars who seem to be, giving the general sort of framework of discussion. How does it all work?
ALEC was founded in the early 1970s by Paul Weyrich, a very far right-wing politician, social activist, along with other folks who were active in the community, and it had a pretty sleepy existence for a number of years, although a lot of success behind closed doors. What we've learned is that ALEC is different. It describes itself to its own members as a unique partnership for corporations, for the private sector and the public sector. It is a unique partnership. ALEC describes for its members how they get an equal say and an equal voice and vote. That's the language they use.
So they meet up, and then what happens? I mean, I don't understand this. How does the model legislation appear?
So ALEC provides both public sector and private members an equal opportunity to present legislation as ideal. In the case of the Stand Your Ground law, the Shoot First law in Florida, that bill was proposed to a secret closed-door meeting of ALEC's Criminal Justice Task Force by the NRA's lobbyist. The NRA's lobbyist...
National Rifle Association.
Pardon me, the National Rifle Association, which is a special interest group that supports gun rights and is also funded by the gun industry. The NRA's lobbyist presented that bill in a closed-door meeting with Walmart Corporation as the co-chair of that meeting. The NRA reported...
Walmart, the largest seller of guns in America.
The largest seller of long guns and also ammunition in America. Walmart co-chaired that meeting along with a Texas legislator. At that meeting, the NRA presented its bill as an ideal bill to pass the country. That was unanimously approved behind closed doors in that task force meeting. In fact, the NRA reported at the time that it was well received. Then the ALEC board ratified that decision. That's the public sector board, and that was in 2005. The next year, the NRA's representative came back to ALEC, reported how great it was going, that this model bill was being embraced across the country.
And you can see a direct link then to what appears in state houses around the country.
That's right. And since then, the NRA has counted that in 34 states in the United States, that bill is passed in whole or in part. ALEC counted that as part of its legislative scorecard. It touted it in publications, and it touted it in an interview with the NRA. This was a priority bill for ALEC, and ALEC has a long-standing relationship with the gun industry, with the NRA.
I think you make this sound a lot less democratic than it actually is, because in those meetings, anyone is able to bring up a suggested model bill, and people have to present the case for and against it. So I used to work at the Cato Institute, and in many cases, we had our scholars participate, or people I know from other organizations in town, vote on legislation and say, no, actually, this is a special interest carve-out. This is a corporate carve-out. This is a handout. And so once legislators hear both sides of the issue, then they vote on it. In this case, it was something that legislators liked and supported. Well,
that's interesting. I mean, where did this initiative come from? Was there a public clamor for new laws on this topic? Were existing protections not working? Was this something that the politicians campaigned on to get into office?
There certainly wasn't a public clamor. This wasn't a bill that people were clamoring for. This is a bill that the NRA wanted to push and did push and was embraced. And it's not just the politicians who vote in that task force. It's the politicians and the corporations and the think tanks, and they vote as equals.
No, that's actually not true. That's not true.
I have the bylaws. The bylaws are absolutely crystal clear on this, and we have records that demonstrate votes by the public sector and the private sector. It's absolutely true. And beyond that, what happens is that those legislators walk back out of their state houses, people like Debbie Lesko, and they introduce those bills in the State House, cleansed of any reference to the fact that they were pre-voted on by corporations and by politicians like themselves, and they push them forward sometimes as if it's their own idea. I think the American people have a right to be concerned about that.
Things weren't
This is a group where people share best practices. This is a law that we've enacted in our state, and it seems to have worked well. Of the Stand Your Ground law in particular, I saw you on MSNBC last week talking about this. Of the 25 states that have a Stand Your Ground law, also I'd like to point out that the converse of that is a duty to retreat law. 9 of those 25 states actually were states that voted for President Obama in 2008. So this is not just a big, vast right-wing conspiracy. These are bills that have passed in a bipartisan fashion in the state legislature.
To change the makeup
but this is fascinating because for a state bill, let's take a look at this. This Florida bill was introduced by 2 ALEC legislators in the State House. But who presented that bill to the ALEC task force? The NRA presented that bill. The idea that these are just bills that legislators are thinking of overnight in their house and they wake up one day and they come into ALEC and present it, you know, a lot of those bills are introduced by corporate special interests and by special interest groups like the NRA.
But the other argument is that it's simply about understaffing in state houses and for local politicians. This is the sort of legislation people want to do, but they just don't have the time. Well, and so it helps if there's already a ready-made bill for them to vote on.
That's actually ALEC's secret of its success is that in most state houses, legislators make between $40,000 and $80,000 a year. It's a part-time job. Sometimes they only have one staffer. They don't have the capacity to write all this legislation themselves. And here comes ALEC with the corporate lobbyists pre-writing a lot of these bills, coming in, arming them with these bills, and then having them walk back out pretending it didn't come from ALEC.
You know, I'd like to compare ALEC back to NCSL, though. ALEC is a voluntary organization. Their stated underlying principles are individual liberty, limited government, federalism. So, you know, they're Jeffersonian principles. And so if a legislator agrees with that, you know, be they Democrat, be they Republican, be they independent, they can join this organization. The National Conference of State Legislators, which is a liberal-leaning organization,
is bipartisan, actually.
It's bipartisan, and the leaders alternate every year, Democrat versus Republican. That is not the case with ALEC.
The NCSL actually is paid for of their $16.8 million budget. Your organization ran the numbers and found that over $10 million of that comes from state coffers, and so that's tax money. Those are my tax dollars as a Virginia citizen, as a former Illinois citizen, and that's, in my opinion, money that is also, you know, they're putting forward legislation to serve the same purpose.
It's not the same purpose.
Rashad Robinson, actually, let's take a look at the range of companies who are involved with ALEC, actually. We have a list here somewhere. According to the Center for Media and Democracy, as much as 90% of the funding for ALEC does come from corporations and foundations. Members of its private enterprise board include a who's who of major U.S. corporations. The pharmaceutical industry is represented by their lobbying organization, Pharma, along with GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. The power and fuel sector has board members from ExxonMobil and Koch Industries. Other leading corporate board members come from the largest retailer in the U.S., Walmart, as we just heard, the international delivery company UPS, and communications giant AT&T. The board also includes organizations with a keen interest in questions of law and order, such as the American Bail Coalition. Rashad Robinson, then, why do you think these companies decide to pay to be a part of ALEC?
I mean, I think one of the benefits of ALEC is that it does its work behind the scenes. It doesn't leave a whole lot of fingerprints. So up until these last couple of weeks, most Americans probably never heard of ALEC, and they don't have a name that you remember. As you probably tried to do and get someone to come on the show from ALEC to discuss this, you probably couldn't. Most news networks are not going to be able to get someone from ALEC to come on and talk because their goal is to be behind the scenes. And corporations can invest their money to put resources behind laws that Americans don't want, and they don't actually have to answer for it. State legislators can go back to their state houses with ALEC legislation and tout them as if they're their own, accept the praise for having thought leadership and passing bills and writing bills when in fact they didn't. And ALEC can sort of do this behind the scenes. I think the power and the importance of the campaign that we're running is that we're shining a light. we're shining an important and critical light on what happens behind closed doors in Washington, so that Americans of all races, of all classes, of all political affiliations can make a choice about sort of, do they want to support corporations that invest in this type of backroom deals in Washington? Do they want to invest money in insurance companies or buy products from companies that are supporting an organization that works to push shoot first laws around the country or discriminatory voter IDs? And it's not enough for these corporations to simply say, well, we only cared about what ALEC was doing on the beverage tax. The idea that these corporations are putting money into an organization that has such toxic policies and can sort of turn their eye to the rest of what ALEC is doing doesn't make sense at all. As someone who runs an organization, a nonprofit, I would never ask donors to come on board and support work that we were doing if they weren't willing to accept the full body of our work. And donors who do come and invest in our organization have to understand that we're going to do a variety of different work, and they have to be comfortable with that. So for corporations who are leaving ALEC, I think it sends a clear message that they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to get these bills passed behind the scenes without any fingerprints. But once the public knew about it, once a light was shined on it, once Americans understood what was happening behind the scenes, they were no longer willing to have a relationship with ALEC.
Actually, we have Coca-Cola's statement
about how popular these laws are.
We have Coca-Cola's statement about why it cancelled its membership of ALEC. It said the Coca-Cola company has elected to discontinue its membership with the American Legislative Exchange Council. Our involvement with ALEC was focused on efforts to oppose discriminatory food and beverage taxes, not on issues that have no direct bearing on our business. We have a long-standing policy of only taking positions on issues that impact our company and industry. Lisa Graves, I mean, is that good enough, though, to say that, look, just because we're a member of ALEC, and there are many companies corporations that do take this position and aren't leaving ALEC, doesn't mean that our fingerprints are all over all the legislation. We're only there to influence our pet causes, so don't worry about it. I mean, does that work?
Well, corporations like Coca-Cola were leaders of ALEC. They were on the corporate board, the private sector board of ALEC, and other corporations like Intel that are no longer on the board. Their money helped pay ALEC's expenses, helped pay for ALEC operations, and helped pay for ALEC's agenda. And so we think all the corporations that are funding ALEC, that are providing general support to ALEC, should be held to account. And that's only the tip of the iceberg in a way, because we also know that a number of corporations are providing funding and gifts to fund scholarships, so-called scholarships for American legislators to go to fancy ALEC resorts, to have their trip paid for, to have their hotel subsidized, in order to have these closed-door meetings with lobbyists.
I was going to ask them, I mean, other than the general agreement with so-called Jeffersonian principles, are there any other incentives for legislators to move forward with the sort of model legislation being brought up in ALEC?
Well, I think Nicole has pointed out the exchange of ideas, and that's certainly something that happens at those meetings. But part of what happens is that ALEC is one-stop shopping for corporations, for corporate lobbyists, to go and see all the legislators, a significant number of legislators, maybe 1,000 or more legislators from all over in the country, and push their ideas and get their model bills, their wish list, into the hands of these politicians.
But there's no further, I mean, is there any more campaign contributions? All that? Is there anything even more murky about this?
The politicians, I think, get a benefit too. They get introduced to corporate lobbyists, to rich and powerful corporations and lobbyists. And there have been at least 2 major studies, including one by Common Cause, that talks about the number of political contributions by ALEC corporations and ALEC corporation employees, who may or may not know what ALEC is up to, who are contributing to these candidates.
Nicole, Neily, Lisa uses the term lobbying there. Of course, the whole point about ALEC is it's not technically a lobby. It actually has charitable status, and therefore that's one of the reasons why there's been so little transparency about what goes on when they meet all these politicians. Why isn't this lobbying? What's the difference between what happens at ALEC and what a lobbyist organization would do?
We have such a labyrinth tax code that how we define lobbying is so narrow that there are lots of organizations in town that are advocacy organizations, that are policy advocacy. So it's such a gray area in Washington.
Why is ALEC a 501c3s or whatever it is, I think? Why does it have that status and not actually the status of a lobbying company when it clearly has such an influence? I mean, clearly there are interested parties meeting politicians, and it has such an influence on legislation.
Not being an ALEC employee, I can't give you the full rundown. I would assume that it's because these are suggested ideas, these are suggested topics. They're not actually pushing. They're not actually advocating in favor or against bills in specific state houses.
But the bills are being drafted at this meeting, though.
They're being suggested and they're being voted on. I think it's a weird
Right. No,
distinction.
I appreciate Nicole's point on that. The documents that we have based on Sunshine in Government Act requests from FOIA requests from states across the country show that ALEC does play a role in pushing these bills in state houses across the country. And in fact, ALEC, one of its major bragging points to corporations is that over 800 of its bills are introduced in state houses across the country every year, and over 20% pass. This is a major part of ALEC's operation to get these bills introduced. And in fact, under ALEC's published bylaws, the state elected officials who are the leaders of ALEC have a duty to get those bills introduced and passed. That's why Common Cause and others like CMD have raised serious questions about why this group should have any 501c3 tax status.
501c3s actually, as the IRS law is written, actually can spend 20% of their time and budget on lobbying activities. So breaking down the $6.8 million,
we better swiftly move away from the IRS element or the taxation element.
Very boring.
But you're talking about the need for legislators to declare these sorts of interests, and the mask doesn't slip very often, but there was this fascinating example in November of 2011, a Florida state representative did introduce a law calling on federal government to reduce corporate taxes, but she forgot to remove ALEC's mission statement from the bill. So actually, it began, it's the mission of the American Legislative Exchange Council to advance Jeffersonian principles of free markets. And then she later reintroduced that without the bit about ALEC in there. But I mean, that really is pretty shocking. I mean, how often are people simply cutting and pasting, and every now and then forgetting to delete the obvious bits? I mean, that surely, I mean, it's pretty frightening, even for someone who.
Oh yeah, no, I agree, and that was very stupid of her. But
I mean, this is going on all over the country.
But it's also going on.
It was very It was very stupid of her, it was very stupid of her, but she, you know, but unfortunately, the bigger question, and the thing I think all of us have to fear is for the folks who aren't stupid, for the bills that get pushed from ALEC every single day, where the people remember to take off ALEC's stamp and remember to take off ALEC's mission. I think it once again goes back to the point that Lisa was making about how deep these connections are, and how much influence ALEC does have beyond just sort of having conferences and helping sort of to make connections. They truly are making sure that these bills get introduced and passed around the state, which is why when we started getting on the phone with places like Pepsi and Coke and started to have deep conversations with them and let them know what we knew, thanks to the great work of folks like Lisa and the work that her organization and others have been doing on the research side, we were able to really shut down any type of conversation about sort of the way in which some corporations want to support both sides of the aisle or support things that Democratic legislators are doing or Republican legislators are doing. What ALEC is doing is really outside of the best principles of democracy. But
I mean, isn't ALEC just a symptom, though, of the rottenness of the whole system? Though? I mean, if Coca-Cola doesn't do it for ALEC, isn't it going to just go through the normal lobbying procedures anyway? I mean, isn't it just one part of all this?
Well, I do think Americans from really the bottom line for international viewers and nationally is that Americans from all political stripes, independents, Democrats, Republicans, agree that corporations have far too much power in our democracy, far too much influence over policy, and we think ALEC is a symptom of that. And for me, when I looked at this research about these ALEC corporations and their role, I was a lobbyist for the ACLU working with libertarians and others on trying to improve the Patriot Act to protect individual rights, to protect people's fundamental Bill of Rights issues. And I never had a politician say to me, hey, here's the deal. I'm going to give you an equal vote to me on this. I've suggested ideas for improving laws. This takes it to a whole new level. This is when politicians go behind closed doors and basically pinky swear. They already pre-voted on this legislation. This isn't ordinary lobbying. When that legislator goes back in the State House, he's like a super lobbyist for those corporations. I think that's a symptom of something indeed very rotten in our democratic system.
OpenSecrets.org just recently, I think today or yesterday, came out with a study showing that, yes, even though Coca-Cola has pulled their money from ALEC, they have certainly not cut back on any of their federal contributions. I'm sure Pfizer, and once you start to run all those various corporations, there is still a tremendous amount of money in politics. My concern, though, is with Rashad and Lisa's position is that I think you're underestimating the intelligence of our state legislators, because some of these bills are introduced and a lot of them aren't passed in ALEC. A lot of them are brought to state houses and they're voted down because they're bad, they're stupid, they're poorly written. And so you know,
that's a
Last
fair,
word,
that's
Lisa.
a fair point. And there are some bills in ALEC that haven't gone anywhere. But we've traced, along with Common Cause, along with People for the American Way, with the Progress Now groups and others across the country, these bills popping up in states across the country, common language, common echoes of bills, changing the worker rights of people in this country, changing voting rights of people in this country,
Climate change, of course,
challenging climate change and suggesting that states should not be involved in regional agreements on climate change. The ALEC echo, the ALEC DNA is strong, and so they've been very effective, and we think that people have a right to know that.
Lisa Graves, thank you very much. Nicole, Neily, thank you. Rashad Robinson, thank you very much too. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.